There are some things in life that you don't realize are endings until they're already over. The last meal we shared was one of those things, and I think about it more than I should. It was a Sunday, one of those slow, golden Sundays where the light comes through the kitchen window at just the right angle and lands on the table like it's trying to stay. Nobody planned it as anything special. Nobody said, let's make this count. And maybe that's exactly what made it count. She had been cooking since early morning, and the whole house smelled like garlic and rosemary, and something underneath that I can only describe as belonging. If a smell could say, you are home, that was it. The table wasn't set perfectly. There were mismatched glasses, a folded paper towel standing in for a missing napkin, and a centerpiece that was really just a half-used candle she'd lit for no particular reason. But something about the imperfection of it was more beautiful than any table I'd seen set with intention. The food came out in waves the way it always did at her house. Nothing arrived together. Everything arrived right. First came the bread, warm and slightly torn at one end like it had been tested already, which it had. I remember wrapping both hands around that bread and feeling the heat move through my palms and thinking, without thinking, that this was one of those moments. The butter melted before I could even spread it, and that small, quiet thing felt like a gift. The soup followed a deep, brick-red tomato bisque with a swirl of cream on top that looked almost too careful for the rest of the table. She'd made it from scratch the way she always made things from scratch, which is to say, with a kind of stubborn love that couldn't be rushed. I took the first spoonful, and it was the kind of warm that starts in your throat and spreads outward until your whole chest feels settled. There's no other word for it. It was settling, like something that had been slightly off all week just quietly corrected itself. Conversation moved the way it does when no one is performing for anyone. Slow circles back to old stories. Small detours into questions nobody had answers to. Laughter that came without announcement. We talked about a trip we'd never taken, and somehow that felt more real than trips we had. She said something at one point about how the best meals are the ones where time stops negotiating with you, and you just agree to be wherever you are. I didn't write it down, and I wish I had, but the feeling of it stayed, even if the exact words drifted. The main course was pasta wide, hand-rolled pappardelle with a slow-cooked ragu that had been simmering since before I arrived. Maybe since before I woke up that morning. Each strand of pasta held the sauce the way only handmade pasta does, like it was designed to carry something worth carrying. I remember her saying the secret was patience, not a particular ingredient, not a technique, but patience, and that you couldn't rush the flavor out of things. You could only give it time to arrive. I've thought about that sentence in contexts far beyond cooking. The wine was an inexpensive red she'd had in the cabinet for months, waiting for no occasion in particular, which meant it was perfect for this one. It tasted a little like blackberries, and a little like the argument we almost had 3 years ago that somehow deepened everything instead of breaking it. Midway through the meal, someone brought up a memory from 10 years prior. One of those stories that had been told before, but hadn't gotten old. And the table leaned in together, the way tables do when the story is good. For a few minutes, everyone was 22 again, and nobody minded. The dessert was simple, a lemon tart with a crust that shattered when you pressed a fork into it, which she said meant it was done correctly. The tartness hit first, sharp and bright, and then gave way to something sweet and almost floral that lingered on the back of the tongue long after the bite was gone. She made coffee in the old stovetop mocha pot, the one that had survived 4 moves and a small kitchen fire, and the sound of it gurgling and hissing was its own kind of music. There's something about that sound in a quiet kitchen that says, stay a little longer, and we did. We sat with our coffees long after the food was gone, talking about nothing pressing and everything important, the kind of conversation you can only have once the agenda is finished. I kept thinking I should leave, and then not leaving, and being glad each time. At some point, someone put on music, low enough to be background, but present enough to feel intentional, and it wove itself into the conversation the way the right music always does. I don't remember every song, but I remember feeling that whoever chose it had chosen correctly. What I remember most vividly is the light changing the afternoon gold, softening into the bluer tones of early evening, the candle becoming necessary in a way it hadn't been when it was lit. The meal had started in daylight and stretched itself into something else entirely without anyone noticing the transition. There was a moment, right around that blue light hour, where everyone at the table was mid-sentence, or mid-laugh, and I sat back for just 1 second and looked at all of it. I thought not in words, more in a kind of full body knowing, remember this one. That's the thing about truly memorable meals. They don't announce themselves. They don't come with a warning that this particular combination of food and people and light and conversation will matter more than you expect. They just happen, and you either notice or you don't. I noticed, but only barely the way you notice the last note of a song a half second before it ends. There's a particular grief in that, in catching something as it's already completing itself. We said our goodbyes slowly, the way people do when the evening has been good and leaving feels slightly like a mistake. There were 3 separate false departures, coats put on, then set down, then picked up again, because no one was quite ready to let the temperature of the evening drop. When I finally did leave, and the cold air met me outside, I stood on the front step for a moment longer than necessary. The kind of night that makes you want to memorize it, even though you know memory is unreliable and will soften the edges over time. Driving home, I kept replaying fragments, the sound of the mocha pot, the way the bread tore, the exact angle of the light at that blue hour moment. Not because I knew it was the last time, but because some part of me that operates below consciousness was archiving carefully. It was the last meal we shared together. Not because of a falling out, not because of any dramatic rupture, but because of the quieter ruptures that life makes without permission. Distance, change, the slow drift that can happen even between people who love each other. The meal lives in me now differently than other meals do. Other dinners I remember as events. This one I remember as a feeling that entire afternoon and evening became, it's less like a memory and more like a room I can still walk into. I think about what made it so, and it wasn't the food, though the food was extraordinary. It was the combination of that food and those people, and that light, and the absolute absence of urgency. Everyone willing to stay a little longer for no particular reason. There's a lesson in that, maybe about how the most meaningful things rarely come labeled. We spend so much time preparing for important moments that we sometimes miss the ones that arrive without preparation, dressed like ordinary Sundays. I've tried to recreate pieces of it since similar pasta, similar wine, similar table, and you can get close, you can get technically accurate, but you can't recreate the specific gravity of a moment that has already passed. The variables that mattered most were not the kind you can plan.